At that point, the whole world would follow because they'd see the prosperity in Immortalis and the health in Immortalis and the safety in Immortalis. That's the life we were meant to live. We're not living that anywhere on the planet today.
So I've heard you talk before that there hasn't been much innovation. You have, AI, information technology, the computer, and the internet. But besides that, in the last, 40 years or so, you say how there really hasn't been that much innovation.
Well, yeah, in fact, let's look at the area that you just mentioned where there has been a lot of advancement, and that is information revolution, the computer, the internet, and now AI. Well, that's because there has never been really heavy-handed government regulation over the computer and internet and information technology. So that's where you do see advancement. But everywhere else, you have heavy government regulations, and that stems back to something that I call initiatory force, which is the scourge of mankind that holds everything back. And that's always been the case in any civilization under the ruling class. You have a ruling class, and they use initiatory force to establish certain regulations, laws, and that holds everything back. That's why we haven't had really great innovations in the past 40 or so years. I realized this, quite some time ago, and over a dozen years ago, I started a political party, a third party called the 12 Visions Party, the TVP for short. And the whole idea behind that was to remove initiatory force with something called the prime law. The whole purpose of the 12 Visions Party was to try to promote the prime law for with the end goal of having it being the 28th Amendment to our Constitution, the Prime Law Amendment. And the Prime Law banishes initiatory force, not just among society itself, but among government itself. That's never happened before.
And what is initiatory force?
Initiatory force is the initiation of force. You can have self-defense force, and that's the real purpose of government, is self-defense force, protection. That's the primary reason and purpose of government. Once government grows beyond protecting the people, then it's entering the world of initiating force on the people through regulations. So that's why I said, the 12 Visions Party over a dozen years ago. The whole thing was to promote the prime law, which banishes initiatory force throughout all society and throughout government itself, which has never been done before. Every ruling class, every society, it was inherent in the governing body that they had the right to initiatory force.
The prime law, which banishes initiatory force, what does that mean?
Well, it's not the government's role to tell businesses what they can and cannot do, to tell people what they can or cannot do. That's all supply and demand. That's all left to the marketplace. When the government has all these regulatory bureaucracies, for example, trying to say what you can do, cannot do, it just keeps pushing down and suppressing and limiting the natural flow of business. And eventually it gets to be too much. And what we're experiencing in America today is you start killing industries, you start killing businesses, including small businesses, the engine of our country. So it's a matter of saying, no, government, that's not their role. Their only role is protection of the people, nothing beyond that.
Okay. And so let's say, someone was doing something bad that like really did hurt the environment and things. So how would that be handled if the government can't come in and say, no, you can't do that?
Well, if the situation is this, that that say there's let's just say there's a community, and then a factory comes and starts putting harmful chlorine gas into the air. Well, it would be a self-defense force situation where the government would come in and stop that from happening because the people were there, their community was there, and then all of a sudden there's a danger to their community. So that would be a legitimate role, a government, as opposed to a bunch of bureaucrats sitting around and saying, let's pass this regulation and let's for these sound good portfolio building reasons that really are not have nothing to do with protection or stopping initiatory force. Then those have gone beyond the parameters of the prime law and have gone into the realm of initiatory force, which is only going to hurt society and business.
Well, isn't that the same argument that they use now that can't drill coal or or you can't mine for coal or drill for oil because the world will end in 12 years.
Right. But you have to have scientific uh, evidence that they don't have. They have
Well, they say 98% of.
consensus. Consensus is not scientific evidence. Go back in time when Christianity ruled the Western civilization, and you had a consensus that the earth was flat and that we were the center of the universe, and there was an above heaven and a below hell. And you had to go along with consensus in order to, there's reasons, in order to get money or grants. Well, they didn't call them grants in those days, but to be supported by the church, or to avoid execution. Uh, Nicholas Copernicus was the astronomer who broke through and developed the heliocentric, the sun being the center of the universe. And he waited until he was on his deathbed to release it because he knew, or he was afraid of what could come to him in the form of punishment. So consensus itself, to be in good graces with the powers that be or to get your grants or whatever, consensus really mean nothing. You have to have scientific evidence. And they really don't have any scientific evidence. You have your political scientists and then your genuine scientists. So it would be a determination of finding the legitimate scientists, not the politically or those who are politically motivated scientists, which the whole global warming and all that, they're politically motivated.
So not much innovation over the last 40 years besides, computers, AI, and the internet, um, which are all information technology in that one industry. Why? Because it was the least regulated industry. All your other industries like um, nuclear, biotech, and even though biotech's making a big comeback right now,
Mm-hmm.
but still in um, health and all these other industries, you're not really having true innovation, like major innovation like we used to. Um, and the ones that we are having now are too few and far between. Why? Because of the regulation and legislation and litigation. The government should not tell a business how or how not they should run their company, how or how not they should do research in the medical field, um, and all these other fields. And how do they get their power? How do they actually make sure, or how do they actually tell a business what to do or what not to do? Well, the root of all evil is initiatory force. Initiatory force is the only power, the only weapon that the government has to be able to block progress, prevent innovation, and keep its unearned power over society. And so, for me, um, you have the prime. You um, discovered that the only way to get rid of that and to take the lid off of society, take the lid off innovation and business, so researchers can flourish, so scientists can flourish, so business heroes of society, they can flourish, and we take the lid off humanity and unleash humanity's potential. Because right now we have the lid of the government blocking and suppressing innovation, people from rising up, businesses from rising up. They have a hand that just keeps getting heavier and heavier, pushing everybody down every single year. And the only way to remove that lid, to free the hand where people can spring up, where all industries and innovation will spring up in all industry, from housing, energy, nuclear, blah, 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 is initiatory force. And that's where you come in. You've identified this. You spent 45 years identifying this. You're laying the psychological, emotional, and philosophical and political groundwork and framework to be able to remove that block, that lid on society. And so you have something called the prime law, which actually bans that and then changes the dynamic, the paradigm of governance that we know today, because the loop. And then you could talk about the loop and that vicious cycle And the average lifespan of any country is 150 years. For an empire, it's a little more than that. But nonetheless, we see America degrading today, the freest country, the country born on freedom. Um, Now it's just declining and declining. We see that, even more and more every day. Um, and why? Because of the vicious loop. And even in health, and then talk about health and the anti-aging and longevity. When you were a kid, they said we could have biological immortality, back in the 90s or whatever, in 10 years. Well, they're saying that now, another 10 years. And why? Because they don't realize it's the loop. Always breaks down anything, pulls down anything good. New countries, America, industries, nuclear, industries, um, health, energy, you know, and then, which is why you're starting a new country with a new paradigm of governance that doesn't have that lid.
That's such a great overview, Wallace, really about who we are and what we're doing. So, what are we going to do about that? Well, over a dozen years ago, I started a new political party called the 12 Visions Party, or TVP for short. And the whole idea was a 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The whole idea was to uh, basically promote this concept of the prime law, which banishes initiatory force throughout government as well as throughout society. So that was an effort. We did quite well. We made a lot of headway. We were very active in a number of states. Actually, in the third party write-in votes, we tied for, I believe it was 7th place, and that was, with a very, very minimal money and but a lot of effort from the visionaries, we call them, the 12 Visions Party, the visionaries. But a third party in the United States is almost never really been able to break through, at least in modern times.
Right, pretty much never.
Right. And so what I've recently realized is the move we need to make, and largely because of the great breakthrough integration that Balaji made, and you were at the Network State conference in Singapore, the whole concept of a network state, and that's how you can actually start a digital country. And there's a lot of very interesting and a lot of merit behind that approach. So I realized that this is the way to go, to start a network state country called Immortalis that has all of this. The prime law is actually its constitution, as you know.
So instead of modifying or changing the country from within, you're taking an external approach.
Yes, and the whole idea there is to get more attention through bringing in some larger players down the road. The network state basically is starting a digital country. You have citizens all over the world. And the more citizens you have, the more GDP you have, if you add up all their income, which gives you more influence out there. It's a great way to get your information out there and gain some influence and power through this process. And you'll start, say, a crowdfunding, perhaps even your own digital currency. But the idea is that we start a digital country because it's very difficult, nearly impossible to get land. But the 10-year goal is to get enough money, get enough sources, and get enough power players behind us. For example, if you just do a Google search, billionaires who want to live forever, you'll be shocked at how some of the richest people in the world are all in on life extension and the quest not to die, on human longevity. They've poured hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars into this. So when they see, these powerful people see that we have, with our prime law constitution, where the government can never get in and slow things down and retard progress, we will eventually attract some of these people. So now we get some powerful, big money, influential people on board. So that would add a lot of power to our quest. So that could be a quicker route, and that's the idea. That can be a route to actually acquiring land and eventually having sovereignty over that land. And at that point, you would have you'd have it become the medical mecca of the world because all your medical companies and research and development would move there because they're free of the governments off their back. The regulations are gone, and they're just able to move at the speed that's necessary to achieve curing aging and death within our lifetime, within my lifetime. Now, we might eventually get there through AI and so on in America or in Europe or in Asia, but it would be well past my lifetime, well past the billionaires who want to live forever, well past their lifetime. We are the missing piece needed to make these big innovative leaps forward by getting the government off your back, by getting the regulatory state off your back. And when these power players who want to live forever recognize that, and they realize they're spending so much money for such little progress, and then they see what we offer, then we attract people like that. And I want to expand to one other thing, another big possibility. See, when you go to our past, we weren't able to get, we made headway, but we weren't able to make major headway when we're trying to work from the inside with the Prime Law Amendment, with the 12 Visions Party. But when we sort of break from all that and start the network state with Immortalis, which, by the way, is Latin for immortal. So we have this network, this digital country, and we could become the medical mecca of the world at the point of acquiring land and having crowdfunding and some powerful players coming on board. But there's another angle here, and that is I'm going to talk about Argentina, which was really going downhill. They had runaway inflation. And then this fellow, Javier Milei, who is a libertarian, by the way, became president of Argentina. And his whole goal is to get rid of the bureaucratic state. It's quite similar to ours. The difference there is ours takes you into another dimension that Earth has never experienced, and that's a dimension with no ruling class whatsoever, with the prime law as your constitution, and everything within Immortalis is a mutual value exchange. There's no ruling class, and every civilization that's ever existed has existed with a ruling class. Milei, he could potentially relate with what we're doing with Immortalis and the prime law. But as we experience in America, it's just too big to say, okay, the prime law is now your constitution. We were going to do it as a 28th Amendment, which in the end, it would have been the Constitution de facto, because everything would have to pass through the prime law, and the prime law will get rid of all bad law, you see, and all regulatory initiatory force. So it would, in essence, be the supreme law, even as an amendment. But it's very difficult to do that in a big country like America. It would be quite difficult, even with Milei as the president, to do that in a big country like Argentina. But what we could potentially look toward doing is doing what we call a split run. A split run meaning it's an A/B test, so to speak, or a test. And we could encourage Milei, who could really believe in this approach to civilization, to set us up, charter a city-state within Argentina, where we can, in a sense, prove what I write about, prove the universal wealth, the universal health. And I don't mean that in terms that most people think universal health, like government healthcare. That's not what I mean. I mean that everyone will be extremely healthy, because medicine would advance so rapidly in an environment like that chronic diseases, fatal diseases would be cured, including eventually aging itself. And the prosperity, because of what I call the great technological revolution, it would, just as you saw in computers, driving computer power costs so low, so quickly, that would be across the whole industrial landscape, that costs of living would be driven down so dramatically in that mutual value exchange without any regulatory control slowing everything down and suppressing everything. And, the government just gets bigger and bigger every year, but there'd be none of that. So you'd have a great technological revolution. It would be basically the great computer revolution, but across the whole industrial landscape. So everyone would be essentially become very wealthy. Everyone would become very, very healthy, and crime would evaporate because, first of all, the motivation for crime is gone. There's the number one motivation for crime is money. It's trying to steal money here or there, but that's gone now because everyone's going to live like multimillionaires. And also the fact that the prime law, the main purpose of the prime law is protection, individual protection. Every individual is protected. So the consequences would be so swift and severe that there'd be no crime whatsoever. It'd just evaporate. And in fact, crime would just be a theory in a country like that. It would, because there'd be no rational reason to commit crime in Immortalis. So if we were chartered a city-state, and it would quickly become the medical mecca of the world. I know Millay is very interested in longevity because he's friends with the author of The Death of Death, which is all about life extension and immortality. So that could be a connection too. See, the point, Wallace, is when we took this move into a network state, suddenly it opened up a lot of options and opportunities and angles for us to work. We were just sort of buried under the weight with the 12 Visions Party of a massive political structure. So that was our past, the 12 Visions Party. The present is Immortalis and building Immortalis. And once we get to a point where Immortalis demonstrates to the world, whether it's through getting a chartered city-state or just having powerful, influential people getting on board and having the money and influence to purchase a territory or land somewhere and work towards sovereignty. Whatever happens, crowdfunding, crowdsourcing. So whatever happens with the present, the future can be, as we set the demonstration with Immortalis, the future could very well be going back and saving America back to the original 12 Visions Party and the whole prime law, its 28th Amendment, because the demonstration will have been established already. And then America would want to join up in this incredible prosperity. The citizens would welcome the 12 Visions Party, break through the two-party system. And not only would America, but at that point, the whole world would follow because they'd see the prosperity in Immortalis and the health in Immortalis and the safety in Immortalis. That's the life we were meant to live. We're not living that anywhere on the planet today. So that's a little view of our past, our present, and our future.